Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Justin Brown. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. Today, I have James Gilbert on the show. James is currently the CMO at RedRoute and formerly the head of marketing at CRMNEXT, which is actually the original reason that I reached out to him. During his time at CRMNEXT, James built out an internal team that worked on the Banking on Experience podcast and actually led it to over 100 episodes before taking on his next venture. So today, what you're going to hear me talk to James about is what it takes to actually get a B2B podcast to 100 episodes, what it was like to serve as the host, how it felt to leave it behind, what it took to build an internal team, and what he has cooking next. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Justin, so much. It's great to be here, everybody. And I'm excited to hopefully give you guys some nuggets of knowledge. Hopefully it helps.
I'm sure it will. So let's start here. So it looks like the podcast started right around two interesting times. And when I say the podcast, I'm talking about Banking on Experience. I think you had just started at CRMNEXT when the podcast was starting. And then simultaneously, the podcast came to life right when the pandemic had just hit. So where and when did you make your way into Banking on Experience?
So starting the podcast at CRMNEXT was my idea. I came in and made the recommendation to them. This was like literally, you're 100% right. It was in the thick of the pandemic before like the toilet paper crisis, as I like to call it.
Yeah. I think it was like April.
Yeah.
Beginning of April 2020. I mean, that is like no meat in grocery stores.
Yeah.
It's like crazy
So
times.
here's the thing about it. What was crazy is like we had a really skinny team that did not have a lot of skills with podcasting and before. We just didn't have that. So I had a very small team, number one. Number two, we had a vision for the podcast and what we wanted to talk about. And it was around the banking world and the finance world. But we launched our first episode and it was sort of an intro to it. And then the pandemic just hit us hard. And we were like, you know what? We just can't talk about these topics because no one's going to want to be a guest on our show, one. And number two, no one's going to really want to care to talk about finance. It's just not going to happen. So we actually made a shift. It was a risky shift in the very beginning of the podcast where we started inviting doctors. We started inviting medical professionals, no politicians. We kept that out of the books, but just totally different than what we had originally planned with the podcast. And we brought them on. And the first probably month of our podcast was focusing on the pandemic and things that people could do because we knew we needed to provide medium value. It was still not part of the long-term vision of our podcast. We knew eventually that we needed to talk about the things that we provided value with. So we focused on inviting those people, which were never going to be in our ICP, in our buying committee or anything like that. And then we shifted once we started seeing things kind of, I wouldn't say die down because it didn't die down by any means, but it started having a little bit of a downward trend on like people knew exactly what they needed to do during the pandemic. So then we started inviting actual people that could potentially buy our product onto the show and talking about things that they're passionate about in the finance world. And so we had a few questions that we would ask them in a pre-podcast show. And that's what got really fun.
Yeah, we experienced something a little bit similar, but different, which was that we had about 5 or 6 months worth of content already recorded when the pandemic hit. And I remember having like 4 or 5 episodes that were all about content creation strategy at events. And we ended up having to flush like 5 months worth of podcasts down the drain. We thought we were like geniuses and we'd figured out content and let's get way ahead. And we're not going to have to worry about recording anything for a while. and the pandemic hit, and we're listening. And for a while, we did the same thing. We're like releasing episodes that are like pre-pandemic life. And we're like, this just makes no sense to anybody. And we really, we walked away and we had to let all those people know, hey, sorry, I know you came on and joined us, but the content just doesn't make
Yeah.
sense.
And sometimes you have to do that. It's unfortunate for the guests when they're going out and spending their time on that. But I mean, here's the fun part. I bet you were still able to repurpose a lot of that content later when it did become more relevant. So
We ended up completely pivoting our podcast because of it. At the time, we had a podcast that was called Tech Qualified, where we focused a lot more on like sales and marketing, and talking to people like yourself. I think actually you and I had talked about having you on that show, and where I asked a lot more like, I don't want to say they're generic questions, but they were questions that were more like broad, or, what are you doing? What's your like, strategy for demand gen or lead gen or whatever. And after that, we kind of like, it gave us a chance to self reflect, and we're like, what do people need help with right now? And what we saw that people needed help with was the name of the show, Recorded Content, was recording content from home. And that's what we did is we changed the show. We actually started a brand new show, and started from scratch and said, let's just do away with that and let's try and help some people. And, I think we had like 200 episodes of that show. And I think this is going to be like episode 70 of this show.
what was good about the shift that we made during this time was it also allowed us the opportunity to learn from the industry that we were focused on and the people that we knew we needed to have real conversations with. Here's the fun part about what happened in that particular industry, the finance industry during the pandemic. The fun part for them and for us serving them was they are the reasons why our economy stayed afloat. It was the banks and it was the credit unions. And it wasn't the government. It was the banks and it was the credit unions that were giving small businesses PPP loans. And it was those things that were really standing out to us.
Mm-hmm.
So then as we started to make the shift to understanding, okay, we have a real opportunity here to highlight really good work that people are doing. So on the tailwind
Yeah.
of understanding these things and shifting our podcasts and helping people just get through the early phases of the pandemic, then we saw an opportunity to highlight the crazy, amazing work that banks and credit unions were doing to completely shift the businesses that they had. For example, you could not go into a branch. Now, Justin, you know this, during the pandemic, like if you went into a branch at a bank or credit union, if you needed help, like that's your money. Nothing is more stressful
Mhm.
than when you cannot access your money. So you can imagine the amount
Absolutely.
of stress that these organizations faced. They had to change on the drop of a dime their entire business models. I'm talking like instead of doing in-branch visits, they had to do drive-throughs. They had to do video branch visits. There was like privacy issues with that because then people could see stuff, right? So, I mean, they had so much that they were dealing with. And we also saw it as a tailwind for an opportunity for us to highlight those even bigger than the podcast, but doing something which ended up turning into a pretty massive initiative at CRMNEXT called Right on the Money, where we recognized credit unions and banks that were recognized by their peers as the very best during the pandemic to shift their business, which just skyrocketed our podcast. It's skyrocketed our growth.
Yeah, one of the first podcasts that we actually brought on, when we made the pivot, our business years ago was a video business, and then we pivoted to more generalized content creation. And when the pandemic hit, we started moving heavily into podcasting because we saw that so many people were working from home and podcasting was effective. And one of the first podcasts that we actually brought on was with a company called Typhone. They do like digital transformation for credit unions. And so they launched the digital banking podcast. And very similarly, their podcast was extremely successful out of the gates because, like you mentioned, I mean, I remember being, I don't want to say moments away. I don't want to like over exaggerate, but close to the point of like, do I need to go to the bank and like take out my cash and like put it under my mattress? Like, I really don't know. I don't know what's happening, and I want to hear other people who know what's going on telling me about it. And podcasts were a very effective medium at the time to hear real time, what should I be doing?
Yeah, honestly, it was a risky move, but it was the right move. And to be honest with you, like we used our podcasts, I call moments that really make your jaw drop when you're working with people that you're trying to sell to, or you're working with people in an industry that you're specifically part of. I call them wow moments. And we used our
Mhm.
podcast as a wow moment. Like, sure, it was a channel of content creation and an opportunity to open up a door to create a relationship, 100%. But it was also an opportunity to create a wow moment. And what we learned getting to 100 episodes is everybody knew who we were because of our podcast.
Yeah, and we've seen the same thing with so many of our customers. I actually wrote on LinkedIn just today about how one of our early customers, she just had, so they're in the restaurant industry. And so, very similarly, an industry that was hit very hard by the pandemic. And she started right around that time. I believe her podcast also started in April of 2020. And just last week, she sponsored a charity event, but the sponsorship came from her podcast. They had banners with the podcast
Oh,
name on it, and universally recognized now in that space as a thought leader because she was doing a weekly show. I believe you
yeah.
were as well, during a time when so much was changing, and it allowed people to keep up with what was going on in her
Yeah.
space.
I mean, I think that's one of the hardest things when teams are thinking about creating a podcast is like the cadence of it, right? Are we going to be able to manage a weekly episode? And here's what I'll tell you. Your podcast doesn't have to start off as a weekly episode. It doesn't.
Yeah, yeah, you all were just crazy.
As a matter of fact, it doesn't even have to start off as a monthly episode if you really don't want it to. What you need to do is whatever content you put out, it's got to be fire. It's got to draw an audience and it's got
Mhm.
to be something that people want to hear. So if you're only doing once a
Yeah,
month, then make sure that that episode is absolute fine. Like put your team on it and make sure it's amazing. And it won't matter how long the cadence is. You know what they say about scarcity? It creates an audience.
yeah, and when we made our pivot to this show, that was something that we really thought a lot about. When I did the other show, our other show, Tech Qualified, I was interviewing heads of marketing, and I asked them basically 12 questions that could be viable, and maybe I'd ask another one here or there, or go down a pathway or whatever. But it was like 12 questions that I asked to everybody, and it was kind of like a networking tool and whatever. This podcast, we're very intentional with what our content is. Like, for example, when I reached out to you, James, and I said, I want to have you on the podcast for a specific reason. That is that you hit 100 episodes and you did it with an internal team. My audience will be interested in that because these are actual questions that they deal with when they're contemplating doing these things. And so I think when you're very intentional with the content, is very specific to an audience, fire content can really, there's no this is what that's like. It's just providing something that people are going to be interested in, whether you're funny or different or have some sort of like thing you do, whatever it may be, but that it draws people in. It's intentional and you put some thought behind it, and the audience really feels
And
like you
here's the
did.
thing, like we didn't care for it to be the biggest podcast in the world. What we cared about is that it was just genuinely going to help the people that we were talking to every single day. So people in the finance world, that's who we wanted it to help. It could help anybody really. Like we had people that came on and talked about like how to create a will. Like,
Hmm.
let me tell you something. There's a lot of people out there that are younger millennials and even Gen Z and Gen Y. They've never even that thought has not even come in their head. Like,
I just got married. Trust me. I'm gonna have to fit. You're gonna have to send me the
ex-
episode. It might be
exactly. So like
valuable.
there was
Yeah.
episodes that were valuable to the broader market, but our goal was not to like grow this podcast so that it's like, Joe Rogan style and everybody is,
Yeah.
that wasn't our goal. And we were fine with that. So I think that's the other thing. Be okay with your podcast serving the purpose that you need it to serve. Don't try to be everything to everyone, because you won't, right? There's very niche podcasts out there. Some people will only listen to a podcast if it talks about like crime. That's like their cup of tea, right? They want to listen to crime podcasts. They won't set a microphone and they won't put earphones on to listen to our podcast, right? Because that's just not what they like. Everyone has content though that they like, and we knew certain things people wanted to hear in the industry. And so we doubled down on it. One thing that was happening in massive troves during 2020 and 2021 was the shift for businesses to be more focused on culture. So just the phrase of DEI, right? Well, the finance industry was going through massive changes as it was on how they do business. And this became a very, very hot topic. So we brought in people that were experts in those areas and gave people frameworks literally on an episode. This is how you tackle DEI. This is how you help minority groups get access to capital. This is how you tackle things related to gender equality in your bank, in your credit union. And it helps to have people that have literally been in the place that they're trying to make the change speak about it.
Absolutely. And you mentioned niche, and it's something again that we really thought about, and I'm sure a lot of this is fresh on the on the tip of your tongue as you evaluate your new podcast, which we will get into. But yeah, like this podcast has, and I wrote about this the other day on LinkedIn as well, that our current podcast has about 1/5 of the listeners that we had on our previous podcast. Our previous podcast, like I mentioned before, was very broad. It was for heads of marketing, which is like incredibly broad. You can be a head of marketing in B2B, B2C, manufacturing, whatever. This podcast is for small marketing teams of 1 to 5 at B2B technology companies that have an interest in podcasting. So I'm like 4 layers deep on how niche this podcast is, but at the same time, anyone who listens to it knows I'm speaking exactly to them. Like, James, this would be like a good podcast for the people on your current or previous team. And that's what I want to get into next, which is the reason I brought you here, but we're just having a good conversation. But it is like those folks who are like trying to figure this out, and they're getting hired to do these things, and maybe they have some skill sets, but not others, and they can learn from it. But yeah, I mean, we're fine with a much smaller audience that the show means more to, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
So I want to look at how you built out the team. So you decided you were going to build this podcast engine internally. And I don't think people always recognize what building out a podcast team entails. There are tons of skill sets required, from video to audio to people who can write and design. So how did you build out your podcast team?
Well, let me start by saying I didn't build the team out for a podcast. I built the team out for the ability to tackle many things, and podcasts happen to be primary part of our GTM strategy. So that being said, I truly believe in being unconventional, and that includes in your hires. I think too often people go and they hire somebody who has a very narrow focus of skill set. And so they can't think outside the box, and it's almost impossible for them to think outside the box because that's the way they've done it. That's the way that they'll continue to do it. So I recognized that as an opportunity right away. I inherited a couple of people already that had the skill set of writing. A few of them had the skill set of taking content out of a podcast, consolidating it into a blog post. So I had that already on the team. It's definitely a necessary skill to have within your team, to be able to consolidate material from an audio or video file into text that could be searchable with SEO. So had that skill set, but we lacked somebody who had expertise with video. So I found a YouTuber. Tell me a CMO who says that very often. I found a YouTuber, and she's fantastic. She did book reviews for books. So how does that translate to marketing? Well, let me tell you. That's the unconventional, out of the box thinking that I like. I saw her style on her videos, what she was doing on Instagram and what she was doing on TikTok. And I was like, you know what? Like, she can be our video person and our social person. So I hired her and I told her, you're going to own this. I had somebody that PM'd that I knew had the skill set of project managing like content across everything, including writing, social posts, design. That PM ran the show behind the scenes. And I always want to repeat this because I think this is important for those that are going to host a podcast. I always let people know who these people were that were really doing the work. It's easy for us to get on and talk and be on video. It's way harder for the work that they're doing, making sure that it sounds, looks good, gets distributed, that the guests get something. So this PM, she was the magic behind everything. Her name was Summer, and she kind of project managed everything, made sure that the guests also got a follow up from us and a special gift, which we called a wow moment within the podcast, and it blew people away. So structured that. And then we recognized the need for like a unique set of skills with design. So we didn't have like an in-house designer at the time when we very first started the podcast. We're like, we need to get somebody that is actually going to be dedicated to this stuff. And we were like redeveloping our brand and all this other stuff. So we just kind of like, we launched it in what I'll call sort of like a crawl phase. We launched it in a crawl phase knowing that it needed work. And then when we started getting into a walk phase and we brought on the videographer, the social person, the project manager, then we knew, okay, we're in a walk phase. Let's amplify this and make it even better. So we brought in this designer, also very unconventional because they had zero experience in doing anything with graphic design. And we wanted that because the only way that you can really have people think outside the box is that they're not, again, pigeonholed into a very specific skill set. This person happens to be an amazing painter and artist and wanted to learn graphic design, but had never gone down that route. And so we hired them. One of the best designers that I've ever found in my entire life. And I've worked with some incredible designers. This person was bar none at the top. Hired them. They started developing our LinkedIn slide reels, which was something that I think started taking off really in like later phase of 2020. You start seeing like slide reels that are visual in nature, kind of summarize the episode. And let me tell you something, that actually became more important to the guests than sometimes our own audience. But it was a really easy way for us to distribute content as well, because the same stuff Summer was doing to project manage with the content itself and writing it in a blog post. She then would write the descriptions that we would publish with the episode itself in podcasting platforms. That became an avenue for Katie, who was the videographer and social person, to take then and distribute it into social. And then Dylan would take the copy that was just done and he would put it in a beautiful design, and it worked magically well.
And question for you here, something that we've seen, and I like that you did kind of a divide and conquer approach here, because what we've seen is when one person gets tasked with all of this, it can really run them into the ground. How did you avoid burnout with this show?
That's a good question. And what I will say is, like, I think you have to set realistic expectations with your team right away. And that realistic expectation is this: in order to get to a point where burnout is not felt on a consistent basis, you need to get ahead of your scheduling. So in order to get ahead of your scheduling, there's a ramp period that's going to require the feeling of burnout a little bit. And it's a lot of work. And, I set that expectation with the team. I said, look, the first month, maybe two, we're going to record as many episodes as we can. And the goal is to always stay 8 weeks ahead. So 2 months.
Love it.
If we stayed 8 weeks ahead, then the workload would not seem like it's too much. and they could still continue to do the things that were required of them on outside of the podcast, right? So the things that were necessary for us to move the business needle outside of just the podcast being a pipeline or revenue stream for us. That was really, really important. And it's the same approach that I've taken. This will be at RedRoute, my fourth podcast that I've started. So my fourth one.
Yeah, that was going to be my next two questions, which were around consistency. You know, if it's a weekly or even a bi-weekly show, people struggle with consistency and feel like they have their back against the wall to get out that next episode. And so basically what you're saying that you did was made sure you were always 8 weeks
Yep.
ahead.
And to me, and Justin, you could probably verify this too, doing podcasts yourself, but the hardest part is getting guests and coordinating with them. So I did all of that myself. And the reason why I did that is because I know how much the back and forth just completely sucks. So
Yeah.
I did that myself and set the team up nicely so that, when we had a guest, we knew when it was going to be, the date it was going to launch, the topic we were going to be talking about, questions we were going to drive the conversation with. I think that the content of a podcast really needs to be conversational, a lot like this one, and less about like, oh, we've got to get through these questions. Don't do that, right?
Yeah.
Don't let your creativity be stalled by the fact you want to get through certain questions, because if your guest is riffing on a particular item, that likely is going to be more valuable to your audience than any other thing that they say.
I think I came to this interview with like 20 questions prepared. I think I've asked more that are not on my prepared questions than I've asked on my actual prepared questions. So I can vouch for
I
that.
mean, maybe we should ask some of these questions, Justin. Go ask away, man. Like I'm happy to answer it.
No, it's great. And this is what I tell to people who talk to me or ask me. So one of the things that I do with an episode is I set out ahead of time with a topic that I want to tackle that I think might be interesting to the audience. But what I tell our customers and other people is what you set out for may not be where you wind up by the end of the episode, and that's okay. And that's usually actually a good thing and means that you have that you had a good conversation, but it also gives you confidence going in that not every conversation is like organic and goes well and that you meet somebody and just can riff with them. There are very different personalities out there, as I'm sure you probably saw talking to people in the finance world. Not everybody is, like able to go back and forth and have just a conversation where you bounce things off of one another. So I think there's kind of like there's two ways to approach it. I think going in prepared gives you a lot of confidence, but also don't feel the need to stay like so narrow in what you're asking.
Yeah, and we would do. I know a lot of people who don't necessarily do like a pre-podcast interview. We didn't make it required by any means, but we did ask people to do it. And the reason why we didn't ask for like 30 minutes or 40 minutes, we asked for a 15-minute window with the promise to be done before that 15 minutes would ever reach. And all we would do in that, it would just be me and the guest, and I would ask them just a couple of questions. And from those questions is how we would come up with the topic and the questions that would help drive the conversation. And we wanted these questions to also be a point of leverage where we could use them for market research purposes and understand, all right, well, these people are our ICP and we're asking this question the same to every single person. So the responses should correlate with data to tell us, hey, this type of content is what people want, right? That's how we started learning about the DEI initiatives, the focus on culture, even the focus on like financial inclusion, which is a whole big area and topic. So we would always ask them in a pre-podcast interview, tell me something you're passionate about that the rest of the industry disagrees with, and kind of like play around with that a little bit.
What, as someone who, and I looked into your background, I don't think I saw anything about banking, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. How did you feel about being the host of a show that was in a space that maybe you didn't see yourself as necessarily a thought leader in?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I did have quite a bit of experience with the credit unions because I consulted with them for quite a while. But for me, it was more like we weren't talking about the ins and outs of how to run a credit union or how to run a bank. We kept it broad enough where people would want to understand just like the business operations of how to do things the right way. Right. So my best suggestion is to keep the core of your podcast and the purpose of it, keep it to where you can make it human and less about like specific business things because then your host is not going to feel uncomfortable. Like there was a few times on the podcast that I did feel uncomfortable. I was like, shoot, I don't know how I'm going to talk about this. But again, that's why you frame up some questions because if you get lost as a host, you can still frame up a question, let the guest riff and pay attention and listen so that you can pull something from that and give some thought, even if it's a little bit of thought. I think that's a good way to get around that.
Yeah, we have a lot of customers who are nervous at first to host the show when they're in marketing. And, I would say the vast majority of our shows are not marketing focused. They're in cybersecurity or in finance or whatever it may be, but they're being run by the marketing team. Where we do see people tend to struggle is when you're reliant on the CFO to host your finance show, and the CFO has CFO jobs to do. Whereas the CMO or head of marketing like yourself, this is a huge priority. And we tend to see the velocity of the show and the speed with which they can operate be much more effective when the show is run through marketing start to finish, even though the head of marketing or the marketer running the show may not be by trade a thought leader in that space. But the caveat being, and I'm sure you can attest to this, James, once you've had like 20 to 40 conversations with people in your space, like it or not, you now probably know more about what's going on in your space than the vast majority of actual subject matter experts in your space, because CFOs are out there focused on being a CFO for their company, not out there talking to 20 other, 40 other CFOs on a week to week basis. I'm just
Yeah.
using that as an example. But, I think by the end of it, you were probably like, I know a lot about banking and credit unions, let me tell
Well,
you.
it's interesting because the podcast did allow me to learn the space much faster for sure. And, our leadership team really tapped into me as our CMO at CRMNEXT and tapped into me for the expertise of the market. I wouldn't necessarily say it's 100% because of the podcast. Like we were doing a lot of other things too, but the podcast certainly helped. And you are right. If you're struggling with like, okay, let's say you have a senior executive and they're the host of your podcast. And if you're struggling to get them on board, just reframe it so that it's purposed in a way that they can be tied to pipeline and revenue. And it will change the conversation. If you tell your CFO, look, Mr. CFO or Mrs. CFO or whoever, right? Like this, if you do this, you are literally tying a direct line into the bookings. And you'll be able to take credit for some of that, right? It changes the conversation. It will become important to them. And, I don't think anybody at our company at CRMNEXT, and I definitely know that for a fact at RedRoute, like we're excited to get this new podcast going at RedRoute because our entire executive team knows how important this is to market position, to understanding like who we are as a brand, to again the market research side of this. Like people don't think about a podcast as an opportunity to have market research. It really is. It's free. It's free market research, and people don't think about it that way. We always do when we start a podcast.
Yeah, and I, when I'm talking to people who are looking into podcasts for the first time, I really have to pick my battles because I can't say your podcast is going to do everything for you, from the opportunity to create content, to learn about your space, to meet people in your space, to drive revenue through meeting those people who eventually want to buy from you, or the people who listen to the podcast and then eventually want to buy from you. So I have to pick my battles, but I do think the market research space are a piece of it, which I don't talk about enough with potential customers is, or like prospective customers, like people who are going through my sales cycle, is probably the thing I talk most about with people who are active customers who've been with us for 10 to 20 episodes. And they're like, Justin, I've never had a better insight into the minds of the people in our space than when we do this podcast. I'm like, yeah, I mean, you're getting a 30 to 60 minute unfiltered conversation to get to hear about whatever they want to talk about, as well as the questions you want to know about. So, I mean, I think that's a huge piece of it that I don't think people really understand until they
Yeah,
experience
here's
it.
another hack. Invite your customers on your podcast too, and have them talk about a topic that they're passionate about. It will open your eyes a little bit, and it will
Yeah.
also give you a lot of personal data on who they are as a person so that you can create better wins for them as a customer.
Yeah, I speak to every one of our customers on a weekly basis, and I have to stop myself from having all of them on here because I'm like, the way they do B2B podcasting, from my eyes at least, is the right way. So I have to make sure to go out and get people like you, James, who, don't do it my way necessarily, but I like to tell all of those stories from, okay, our customers obviously use an agency. These are the ways that they're able to be successful, but also here are other ways as well. And I actually did an interview with the woman that I mentioned before, who her interview was all about market research and how she worked in the restaurant space, and having a weekly show through the pandemic was able to have her keep a pulse on what was happening in her space. So I mean, I think exactly what you said. Have customers. We lump them into like 5 buckets. We've got customers, prospective customers, partners, industry influencers. And number 5 is internal subject matter experts. So like, I'm sure there are very smart people at CRMNEXT. And you probably had them on the show, or they guest hosted the show or served as a co-host or something along those lines. I think you also did like a co-branded episode where you did an episode and it was another podcast as well. So there's a lot of cool things you can do
Yeah,
with your
absolutely.
show.
We did a series within our podcast. So we were doing it every week at Banking on Experience. And then one of our partners came up with this really good idea of coming up with like focusing on women leaders in the finance world, which there aren't very many of them. And so that was unfortunate. And so we wanted to recognize really great female leaders that were doing incredible work. So we actually went out with this partner and came up with the idea of like, hey, you guys host it and we'll continue to produce it. And so we did. It just became part of the normal flow. We were already doing 4 a month. So the second podcast every month was theirs instead of it being ours. And the other 3 were still ours. So that was just a way to kind of weave it in and get different content and different audiences engaged with our overall goal.
One question that I did want to ask you was, how did the show evolve? And you explained it from your staff that you added and what roles they played. But I'm curious on a more like almost a legitimate timeline
Yeah.
basis. Like, what did the podcast start out as? And over the 2 years of you working on it, how did it evolve?
Well, I like to think of it in a timeline, kind of like I was saying before in the crawl, walk, run phases. Our crawl phase was like,
Mhm.
we didn't have a designer, so I created our artwork. It was pathetic. Okay, I'm not a designer, so it was pathetic. And then we brought on our designer and that evolved. So that was our walk phase. We had project management going on. Our run phase is like we still to this day, if you go and listen to the Banking on Experience podcast, there were episodes pre-recorded and ready to be launched through I think the end of July for CRMNEXT, where I'm still the host. So we were ahead of that even before I left quite a while. So that was the run phase, is us being able to be several months ahead and have more prominent guests and have content that everyone wanted.
How did you feel about leaving a show that you did 100 episodes
I
on?
was pretty heartbroken, if I'm being honest. I still like, we put a lot of work into that. And there's a lot of people that I greatly care about in the industry that I had on that show, that loved that show, right? That listens to it every single week. And we would always get feedback. Oh my gosh, I loved the episode this week. Awesome job. It just became a really good way for us to solidify our brand essence. And our brand essence it was always like always be helping, right? And always be giving. And like so that's something I believe in to my core personally as well. And so it was hard. It was hard for me to leave that. And still is like thinking about it and thinking about having to start a brand new one. That's definitely tough.
Yeah. No, I can imagine. It's why I wanted to ask you about that. You know, the reason that for the audience, the reason I reached out to James was that I saw he posted about the 100th episode and tagged his entire team, which I really also appreciated was, giving the shout outs to the people doing the work because as someone who runs 3 dozen podcasts, I can tell you there's a lot of work that goes into every single episode. And I just had to imagine that 100 episodes in and then getting a new role now, it probably was in the back of your mind as you're people don't stay in jobs forever. And I think you probably knew that as you were building out the podcast. But these things do grow on you and they're a piece of creative that you build over time and they're almost like legacy pieces that'll live on. Maybe your kids one day will probably won't want to listen to it, but you could say, hey, at least I left something, on this planet that I did for 100 episodes and you can learn about who I was and the people I was talking to. It's pretty cool. And it means something to you after you put that much work into it.
100%. And, I'm still really good friends with a lot of the people that we had on that podcast. I still consider them friends and acquaintances that I'll forever have relationships with because of it. So there are advantages to hosting it and to being a part of it to really create a connection that I don't think you can normally get through a lot of other means. So there's that.
So you started your new role
Yeah.
at RedRoute. What role will podcasting play in your new role?
Well, I can't reveal too much of that. It's a little bit of a secret, but it's going to be absolutely massive for us. Matter of fact, for the first time in the 4 podcasts that I've launched in the past, this will be the first one that I'm actually going to co-host. So we're going to have 2 hosts. It's going to be me and our CEO, and we're going to be very edgy on it. It's called Spamming Zero. We're going to be very edgy on it and just not hold back. I think that's what makes really good podcasts and content is when you can create a moment that people are not afraid to just totally be themselves.
Well, with that, there will be more to come. We'll have to do like a follow-up episode at some point. But since we're coming up on our time, where should people go to learn more about you and to learn about RedRoute?
Yeah, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there. And if you want to learn about RedRoute, go to redroute.com. That's our website. And pretty soon you'll see our podcast up there. And yeah, we're excited. Thanks for having me, Justin.
Yeah, absolutely, James. I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on today. It was great having you on Recorded Content.